inhumane conditions of detention.
There was a metal box, a shipping container like those at a port, and they took me there. I stayed inside for 9 days.
Beatings and psychological torture.
I went through the full intake procedure, same as the men. They said, "Give me your palms, you'll be drinking from your hands."
Sexual violence.
He said, "Take this hammer." I took it. He gave me a condom and said, "Put it on."
And murders.
Victoria's body was returned without several organs, making it impossible to determine the cause of death.
Ukrainian women captured during Russia's full-scale invasion became hostages of Putin's regime and victims of the most brutal forms of torture. Their stories are detailed in the special report, Inside Russia's Brutality Toward Ukrainian Women in Captivity. Protected under international humanitarian law, but helpless against Putin's lawlessness and tyranny. In Russian detention centres, colonies and prisons, there are hundreds of Ukrainian women. Some were captured back in 2014 during the occupation of Crimea and parts of Luhansk and Donetsk regions. Others were taken during the full-scale war. They are medics, volunteers, cooks, clerks at military units, relatives of Ukrainian servicemen and ordinary civilians who held pro-Ukrainian views. Vera was caught by the full-scale invasion in her native village of Bakhmutivka. On February 26, 2022, columns of Russian vehicles passed through.
We had no information about anything because there was no electricity. No electricity, no internet.
The Ukrainian flag was immediately taken down from the village council building. The village head began collaborating with the occupiers. In early March, the invaders launched mass filtration of the population.
The village head gave them all the addresses where Ukrainian army servicemen lived. My brother served in the Ukrainian army. He died defending Rubizhna in 2022. Bakulin Ivan Nikolayevich.
Just days later, Russians came for Vera.
I woke up because someone lifted me under both arms. I opened my eyes, and the room was full of men dressed in black, wearing balaclavas with OMON and FSB patches. They started interrogating me, asking me if I knew anyone from the SBU. A million questions about nothing. Where's your phone? Where are the kids? Where are your relatives?
The occupiers tried to accuse Vera of working with Ukrainian intelligence and used the usual Russian method of forcing a confession.
I was hit every time I answered. One of them said, "We'll beat it all out of her. She'll confess everything." There was a floor lamp in the room. He cut the cord from it. Then he grabbed a binder from the table, wrapped the cord around it, and clipped it to my ear. The only thing that saved me was that the cord didn't reach the outlet.
Vera was later taken to the former SBU building in Russian-occupied Luhansk, now controlled by the FSB. That's where the real torture began.
They tied me to a chair with duct tape, hands and legs. Wires were attached to my fingers. Then the interrogation began. Random questions. There were no right answers. Even when I answered, they electrocuted me. They shocked me just because they could. I think they enjoyed it.
After the interrogation, the occupiers took Vera to an investigator. The list of charges shocked her.
Treason, espionage, attempted murder, smuggling of explosives, possession and use of explosives on the territory of the Russian Federation. They told me to sign the interrogation protocol. The only thing I wrote was that I did not admit guilt. I did sign it, but I didn't admit guilt.
Next came a temporary detention facility and humiliation in solitary confinement.
They took off my jewelry and carried it away. One of them stood there and said, "Do you trust me to deliver this to the investigator?" I said, "If I say no, nothing will change anyway." Then they took me for a body search. They said, "Strip." I asked, "What do you mean?" "Strip completely and squat. We'll see what falls out of you."
She was then sent to the Luhansk pre-trial detention centre. Since 2014, this facility has held not only criminals, but also opponents of Russian rule in the temporarily occupied territories.
Girls were brought in on espionage charges. They were placed in separate cells, isolated. There was one girl from Svatova accused of espionage. When she was detained, they poured boiling water on her legs. She would faint from the electric shocks during torture, so they thought boiling water would be more effective. She was sentenced to 11 years.
The innocent Ukrainian woman was placed in a cell with murderers, thieves, and mentally unstable offenders.
There was a woman with schizophrenia who, during a psychotic episode, killed her daughter and threw her granddaughter from a second-floor balcony, and then came fall, relapse season. My God, we were afraid to sleep. I'd open my eyes and see her, completely naked, jumping on the cot with 2 immersion heaters.
Vera was returned from captivity on September 13, 2024, along with 22 other Ukrainian women. According to the Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War, over 400 Ukrainian women may still be held in detention facilities in temporarily occupied territories and Russia. This number only includes confirmed cases. Real figures may be significantly higher. Since 2022, 252 women have been released, 209 military personnel and 43 civilians. Math teacher Victoria Andrusa was kidnapped by Russian soldiers from her parents' home in March 2022. She was accused of acting as a spotter and informant for the Ukrainian armed forces.
They said, "You were giving away our positions. We saw you." They even showed my mother. "Look, these are her shoes. We saw her in the neighboring village." And we hadn't even stepped outside the yard because the road was under sniper fire.
In their search for so-called evidence, the occupiers tore the house apart.
During the search, they found my phone and asked, "Who did you message? What did you send?" I said, "I wrote my sister that you're here, on this territory, that we can't leave the house, and that we're scared." That's when they took me away.
Victoria was first taken to a tent camp in the Russian village of Glushkovo, then to the Kursk pre-trial detention center. The beatings began en route, along with threats and intimidation.
They used physical force on me, made terrifying threats with graphic details of what would happen if I didn't cooperate. This was said by a man in military uniform.
At the Kursk facility, Victoria underwent the so-called intake procedure. Every blow was accompanied by humiliation.
After some time, they themselves admitted that she was actually the first woman they had who went through the full intake process on equal terms with the men. They emphasized, "Don't think that just because you're a woman, you'll be treated any differently." If she tried to avoid a blow or even stayed silent, refusing to answer their questions, it only provoked them to treat her even more harshly.
After these sadistic procedures, she was processed for detention. Due to beatings by male guards, Victoria began losing consciousness.
I was standing in line while they filled out some paperwork. I said, "I'm going to faint." They told me, "Stop pretending. You're a terrible actress from a second-rate theater." When I actually collapsed, they rushed over and only then tried to revive me, give her some water. But they didn't hand me a cup. They said, "Give me your palms. You'll drink from your hands."
Victoria shared a cell with women who had passed through multiple prisons.
They called it the Russian Golden Ring. They'd been in Taganrog, Olenivka, Veloiki. They came back, but they were skin and bones. There were times when we gave them some of our food. They were always hungry. In the previous colonies, they'd been treated extremely harshly.
The plant in occupied Marupople served as a shelter for hundreds of Ukrainian troops, National Guardsmen, and civilians. It was under siege for 64 days. Due to the intense Russian shelling of the city, Victoria took her 4-year-old daughter with her.
I went around distributing meds to the wounded. That cut my work by nearly an hour. There were a lot of wounded. Our bunker was the last one left in Mariupol by that point.
Staying in the Azovstal bunkers was becoming more dangerous by the day. This video of Elisa in the dim bunker, filmed by Ukrainian servicemen, went viral around the world. On May 5th, with the help of the Red Cross, a humanitarian corridor was organised. Victoria attempted to evacuate with her daughter and other civilians.
The shelling continued daily. The roof above us was gone. We would just look up and see the starry sky.
During filtration, the occupiers discovered Victoria was a military medic. That sent her directly into captivity.
We were unarmed. What weapons did we have? Syringes.
Capturing medics is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. They are not combatants. The First Geneva Convention of 1949 states that medics are protected and cannot be attacked because they perform humanitarian functions, providing aid regardless of the wounded person's affiliation.
The enemy adheres to no international standards of conduct and makes no distinction between military personnel and civilians. Anyone located near a military deployment site or unit, or working in any kind of support role, is still identified as a hostile target. When women were taken captive, especially in occupied territories like Mariupol, Donetsk, or Luhansk, and had small children, the occupiers used that against them. They threatened to send the children to Russia for adoption and told the mothers they'd never find them, or they threatened to harm the children. It was a method of manipulation.
They said, your child goes to an orphanage, you go to prison.
To save her daughter, Victoria had to sign a power of attorney for a stranger who offered to help evacuate Elisa.
There was a girl next to me, Valeria. At that time, I didn't even know her. She offered help and took Elisa to Zaporizhia.
Victoria herself was sent to Donetsk. To get any information about her daughter, she was forced to record a propaganda video.
I asked to call home. They said, if you say what we want in the interview, we'll let you call. I am in Donetsk. They treat me well here. It's not like the media shows. I want my child to be with me. Please return my daughter. And that's how I found out that my daughter was already with relatives and safe.
During her 156 days in captivity, Victoria was held in the Donetsk pre-trial detention center, the Volnovakha correctional colony in Olenivka, where she was sent ahead of the prisoner exchange. The conditions in these detention facilities, both in the occupied territories and inside Russia, constitute yet another form of pressure against Ukrainian women. Lack of basic routines, proper nutrition, access to hygiene products and facilities, forced labour, physical exertion on par with men, torture and abuse. Through such actions, Russia is flagrantly violating the Geneva Conventions.
We were forced to walk bent over, hands always behind our backs, eyes closed so that God forbid we didn't accidentally see anyone. They gave out clothes that didn't fit, on top of everything. Our hands tied, pants falling off, someone else's shoes. One girl wore a size 39 and they gave her a 36.
Every day, the guards mocked and abused the Ukrainian women held captive.
They might say, turn left, and you'd turn, but it was a wall, and you couldn't see where you were going, so you'd hit the wall head first.
Ukrainian women were often denied basic hygiene products. Human rights activist Lyudmila Husseinova knows firsthand what captivity means and how women imprisoned with her in the Donetsk pre-trial detention center under Russian occupation tried to cope.
The women simply had no access to hygiene items. To somehow manage, they ripped up the filthy, foul-smelling, grease-saturated mattresses from the bunks. The mattresses were already paper-thin, stuffed with rags and scraps of torn fabric, crawling with cockroaches and bedbugs. They would pull out those rags and use them as makeshift sanitary pads.
Due to constant stress, malnutrition, and unsanitary conditions, Ukrainian women in captivity began experiencing hormonal imbalances and gynecological problems.
Some women tore up their t-shirts or undergarments to use as pads. But eventually, their periods stopped altogether due to stress and lack of proper nutrition.
One woman even thought she was pregnant. Her breasts and stomach started changing shape due to stress. She noticed it. Some of the staff noticed it too. It turned out to be a case of false pregnancy triggered by stress.
The denial of medical care is not just a form of abuse. It is a war crime. Russia holds particular contempt for Ukrainian journalists. Victoria Roshchina was tortured in the Taganrog pre-trial detention center. In the summer of 2023, she traveled to the occupied territories to investigate the locations where abducted Ukrainians were being held. Then, she disappeared.
She tried to uncover what was happening to Ukrainian citizens under occupation, particularly in places of illegal detention. More specifically, she was investigating the fate of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant workers who had gone missing. She went to Energodar, and that's where she was detained.
For a long time, Russia denied Victoria's presence in the Taganrog detention center. A year and a half after her disappearance, they returned only her body.
Without certain organs, making it nearly impossible to determine the cause of death. The body had undergone various transformational processes, but we clearly saw signs of torture.
Yanina Kornienko was Victoria's colleague. Together with other Ukrainian investigative journalists and with support from Reporters Without Borders, she produced a documentary to uncover what happened to Roshchina after her abduction.
The most crucial evidence came from people who saw Victoria in Taganrog, especially her cellmates. They reported that she was hidden during inspections, moved between cells. She looked terrible. She had lost so much weight, down to 30 kilograms. Even the Russian officials visiting the facility couldn't help but notice. Taganrog is a place where confessions are extracted in order to justify sentencing. Any method is used if a person refuses to comply.
In their investigation, journalists also spoke with other former prisoners of war who had passed through the Taganrog detention center. They confirmed that Ukrainian women were treated with exceptional cruelty there.
I was deeply shaken by the story of a Ukrainian Marine, Inha Chekinda. She described horrific abuse, first of all, beatings.
The lieutenant came into the cell, grabbed me by the hair, slammed me against the wall, and said, "Feet shoulder-width apart." Then he twisted my arms back. He stood behind me and asked, "What's wrong? You a tough nut?" Then he clapped both ears with his hands, hard. I felt like my brain was rattling like a child's toy.
These were attempted rapes, acts of sexualized violence.
At one point he said, "If you don't give me the information, I'll assault your friend." Then he struck her hard in the stomach. She collapsed to her knees. It was incredibly painful. He asked her something vile and degrading. She started crying, saying, "No." She cried from the pain and from the shame. We had stood up for Ukraine, and now they were humiliating us like this. I said, "Let me do it instead." He handed me a wooden hammer. It had a handle, maybe 30 centimeters long. Then he gave me a condom. "Put it on. Now do it."
Violence. It doesn't matter whether it's Donetsk detention, Taganrog, isolation, or any other prison. This is their method. Breaking people, making them submit. They see everyone there as their slaves. This is just one example. In reality, many women return physically mutilated. There are documented testimonies, even from former detention staff now abroad. In interviews with foreign media, they said they were ordered not to hold back in dealing with Ukrainian prisoners.
Tetiana from Marupople survived threats of sexual violence. She and her boyfriend were taken captive by Russian troops for posting Ukrainian leaflets in an already occupied city.
We got caught by accident. A car pulled up. They immediately started checking my boyfriend's backpack. Found the leaflets, threw him to the ground and into the trunk. I was shoved into the back seat. Then they took us to the local police station.
The Russians interrogated them about ties to the Ukrainian armed forces and their attitude toward the occupying authorities.
They checked our belongings, our phones, looked through messages, any pro-Ukrainian music, photos, everything. After about 2 to 2.5 hours, they took me to the courtyard. There was a metal box, like a port container. They put me inside. It was pitch black. No light bulbs, no windows. I sat there for 9 days.
In the container, FSB officers interrogated Tetiana. After some time, she was transported to an unknown location.
They put a bag over my head, shoved me into a car, and drove off. I was led upstairs, over thresholds, into a cell, still with the bag over my head. They stood me facing the wall, hands to the wall. I felt like I was about to be executed. I started trembling. I was in shock.
Later, Tatiana realized she was being held in a temporary detention center at the Marupople police station, which had been taken over by occupying forces. After another interrogation, this time recorded and spliced for Russian propagandists, she was deported from the city.
The order was to get rid of me because I was interfering with their authority. A lot of people were deported. They told me to head in the direction of Zaporizhia. I started walking. A passenger car pulled up with a huge Z on it. They drove me to the next checkpoint.
But they decided to mock her one last time.
They said, "Let's go into the grove for some privacy." They laughed at me and drove off.
This is a method of warfare, breaking down resistance, both among prisoners of war and the civilian population. It's not about satisfying physiological needs. It's about domination. And it affects women of all ages, even very young girls.
Violence against Ukrainian women in Russian captivity is not an isolated occurrence. The scale of torture is terrifying. And on top of that, the Kremlin hides data on the actual number of female prisoners, is reluctant to include them in exchange lists, or outright refuses to return them to Kyiv.
With civilians, things are even more complicated. According to international humanitarian law, Russia should never have detained these people or imprisoned them. But there's another layer to this. Russia occupies the territory, imposes its own internal legislation, forces civilians to accept Russian passports, and then, recognizing them as Russian citizens, begins to prosecute them under domestic law. That makes the process of returning these people significantly more difficult.
Every day in captivity causes psychological, emotional, and physical harm. The consequences of being held in Russian prisons and the trauma endured require long-term rehabilitation.
All the girls, myself included, came back in a state of euphoria, at first just from being free again. During the first weeks, when they asked, "How are you feeling? What hurts?" I'd say, "Everything's fine." But then it hits you. You realize you're hurting. Your body starts to shut down because in captivity, you survive purely on willpower. After a week or two, the panic attacks start. Serious health problems follow. The first thing is gynecological issues. Then the kidneys, of course. Constant cold, dampness, hunger, pneumonia, severe weight loss. Every single one of our prisoners of war and civilian hostages loses at least 10, 20, sometimes 30 kilograms.
We only had cold rations. That's it. So obviously nothing good came of it for my stomach. I was in rehab taking medication prescribed by a psychiatrist. The effects will stay with me for the rest of my life. I remember everything, every date, every event. Rehabilitation took about 3 months. We were given all kinds of help, medical care, rest, document recovery, because when we were released, we didn't get back our passports, driver's licenses, nothing.
The unlawful detention and inhumane conditions faced by Ukrainian prisoners of war, including women, have been condemned by numerous human rights organizations. Amnesty International has compiled reports detailing torture, sexual violence, and other human rights violations. These have already been submitted for review by the International Criminal Court.
They must be held fully accountable at the international level. And it's not just Putin who's guilty, it's the hundreds of thousands of Russians who came to kill, torture, rape, and destroy us just for being who we are.
Russia breaks and kills even those who pose no threat, unarmed, defenseless people entirely at the mercy of prison guards, camp supervisors, and torturers. Today, detention facilities in the Russian Federation and in temporarily occupied territories are a modern-day gulag for Ukrainian women, where abuse and degradation, physical, psychological, and sexual, have become the norm. This is a system operated and endorsed by the Russian state. War crimes and crimes against humanity, personally sanctioned by Putin, which will be punished. Ola Mihaliuk, Special Report.